So I had never been a fan of higher frame rates, but back in 2022, this movie called Avatar: The Way of Water came out, and I heard James Cameron was going to be using high frame rates for this film. Originally, he was going to be shooting the entire movie, but eventually he came to the conclusion that he was just going to use certain sequences to be used with higher frame rates. I was skeptical because when this was used in the past, it just didn't have that great effect. But when I sat down and watched this movie, I was suddenly convinced. I think he's the first filmmaker to actually utilize high frame rates to good effect. It made what would otherwise look like, a soap opera effect actually have a deeper effect in making the CGI, which can often look unbelievable, look believable, because we often associate higher frame rates with the soap opera effect. And this worked to his advantage because suddenly these things that are not supposed to be real suddenly look real when using a higher frame rate. Again, it's that soap opera effect. And the reason that soap operas look like that is because they're shot at a higher frame rate. They're shot on TV cameras, which don't have that cinematic, effect. Now, the higher frame rate, it's a very controversial topic because a lot of filmmakers like the traditional 24 frames a second. And I agree with that. But at the same time, I have an open mind. And I like this idea of pushing technology further for a deeper immersive experience in the cinema, especially when nowadays people are trying to find different ways to bring people into the theater. You certainly can look at technology as a way to improve that. Of course, storytelling, number one, is the best way to be immersed in the story. Having a different gimmick sort of thing can actually be also a positive effect. A couple of filmmakers that have been trying to use this and push this forward, Ang Lee on Gemini Man, which I don't think fully worked, and a lot of the complaints were that you can see through the acting, and I totally get that criticism, and James Cameron has said in interviews as well that suddenly when you're having a dialogue scene between two actors and you're shooting at a higher frame rate, it doesn't look real. There's this unreal effect that you could kind of see through it. For instance, for me, and it's always felt this way, and I think I read this somewhere once, and it really resonated with me that 24 frames a second somehow feels like you're watching the past, and anything above that, like 30 frames, 60 frames, it looks like you're watching something in real time. Which brings me to a man that unfortunately passed away recently, and his name is Doug Trumbull. And he is the mastermind behind 2001: A Space Odyssey's visual effects. And he made it his life's work, especially near the end of his life, to advocate for higher frame rates in his research, innovations, in trying to create this cinematic experience using high frame rates. I don't know too much about it. From the articles I've read, he goes on to say that the key in making the higher frame rates look cinematic is something called the flicker effect, which film cameras and projectors have a shutter. So there's basically this flickering that goes on. And what's interesting is that he's saying that most of the uses of high frame rates in the cinema, and why a lot of people reject this idea, is that there is no flicker. There's not that effect that we associate with the cinema. And it's really interesting because, I haven't seen that projected that way. I haven't seen filmmakers use that, film emulation sort of effect on a higher frame rate. Nowadays, there's a whole generation of kids that are going to be raised on looking at people's iPhone footage on their phone, which is sometimes, defaulted at 30 frames a second. So this idea that, we're used to seeing film, shot at 24 frames a second, I mean, it might go outdated. And I wonder about that. Is it something in our brain that we like 24 frames a second, or is it conditioning? Is it something that we like it because we're so used to it? And if you have this whole generation of kids now being raised to watch stuff on their phones, they might be more open to higher frame rates. But if we could still hold that, cinematic quality for the people like myself who were raised on 24 frames a second as being cinematic, that would be great, because then you could have the best of both worlds. You could have that immersive feeling that higher frame rates give you without having that phoniness effect that happens. There's also been articles that I've read where, like the James Cameron effect, where if you're trying to make something feel real and really immersive, that higher frame rates might be really better suited for that. For instance, With a horror movie, I've heard people propose that this might be really effective in doing that. You see a lot of ghost videos on here, like a lot of these ghost video channels, and a lot of that footage is found footage shot at higher frame rates, and there's something visceral and scary about it because it feels like you're watching it in real time, like a live feed. There are a lot of ways that filmmakers can utilize higher frame rates to great effect, and I feel like we're not quite scratching the surface. And this idea that that it just doesn't work and we're shutting everything down, I don't feel like that's fair. And if there is a piece of technology, a piece of innovation that can be pushed forward and actually give some results back to us, I think that's worth exploring. I feel like higher frame rates is a frontier that has yet to really be explored deeply. So what do you think about higher frame rates? Are you still in love with 24p, and do you think that that's going to be around forever? Or do you think that someday we'll go to the theater and on our ticket stub, we'll see this film is presented in 48 frames a second or 60 frames a second, and that'll be the new normal?